Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast that brings this wonderful country to you wherever you may be. And thank you for joining me once more. If you were with me last week, you will realise that this is part 2 of our tour around Scotland, from Edinburgh to Inverness, then returning to Edinburgh via Loch Ness and Loch Lomond. Last week we toured Edinburgh City and continued up the coast as far as St Andrews, where you were introduced to a fabulous cathedral, William and Kate, and of course golf. Well, in this episode we are leaving St Andrews behind us and continuing north towards Dundee, then on to the ancient village of Dunkeld, the Victorian town of Pitlochry, and on to Inverness, the capital of the Highlands. We've just been standing on the Swilcan Bridge, the most famous bridge in the world. This small, stone-built archway bridge straddles the Swilcan Burn. A burn is a small stream or river, and you've got your old course golfing photos of a lifetime on a bridge that's seen Tiger Woods, Nick Faldo, Rory McIlroy, and all the golfing greats. Well, you can now put your name on that list. It's time to go, and we head back to the car. It's a sunny day. There's a slightly cool sea breeze wafting from the North Sea over the sand dunes and across the old course as we take our leave of this beautiful town. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this tour into the Highlands of Scotland. Once more, we are heading north, towards Dundee, and it's only 40 minutes later we arrive at the Tay Bridge, where, funnily enough, we cross the River Tay. On the right, as we cross, we can see the old shipyards that used to build the whaling fleets of the 19th century. In the 1800s, Dundee thrived on its whaling industry, with long voyages to the Arctic, bringing home lucrative blubber and whale oil to the town. The yards and the old slipways for the whales to be brought ashore are long gone, and in their place we'll see all rig maintenance yards with a number of rigs alongside. On the left, however, is the latest addition to Dundee's waterfront, the new Victoria and Albert Museum building. It's quite extraordinary and quite futuristic, and it actually looks like a ship's bow pointing out into the River Tay. And for those that don't know what a bow is, it's the pointy bit at the front of the ship. It was only opened in 2018 and it is a design museum, the first in Scotland, and the first V&A museum outside London. It's certainly well worth a visit. And as we come off the bridge and just past the V&A, we find a majestic sailing ship. She's a three-master with the proud name of RRS Discovery painted on the bow. She's 132 feet long and 33 feet wide. It's a wonderful sight. It's actually the Royal Research Ship Discovery and was built in Dundee in 1901. Albeit she's now laid up as a living museum. She is actually a bark-rigged auxiliary steamship and the last traditional wooden three-masted ship to be built in the United Kingdom. It's a fascinating history and is connected with Captain Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton on their first highly successful journey to the Antarctic. I mean, this is a story in itself, with an extraordinary tale of the ship being stuck in ice for nearly 2 years, and only escaping with the help of another expedition sent to rescue them, and Discovery being set free by using explosives to break the ice. The interior is as it would have been in Scott's time, and if enough people are interested to hear of this expedition, I'd be happy to do a separate podcast. Just please get in touch. But before we leave Dundee itself, it's worth driving to the top of Dundee Law, a small hill that overlooks the whole city. It's only a 5-minute drive up a steep incline, but there are rewards for making the effort. The first thing you notice at the top is a very large memorial, which was built in memory of the 4,000 servicemen and women from Dundee who gave their lives in the First World War. And from the top, what a view! To the south, the River Tay, the shipyards, the road and rail bridges, and the waterfront with the V&A and the Royal Research Ship Discovery clearly visible. To the north, around the city, it's possible to see the city's past history in the buildings that still exist. The old jute mills, for example, they really stand out. I remember from my school days being taught to remember cities using the letters of the main industries. Well, it did not seem that interesting at the time, and yet as I stand here vividly remembering that while Edinburgh was known for the 3 Bs, books, banks and breweries, Dundee was known for the 3 Js, jute, jam and journalism. It's funny how it all comes back to you all these years later. Now, what is jute? Well, jute's a plant grown in hot climates and has a long, soft, shiny fibre that can be spun into coarse, strong threads. It came to Dundee because the threads had to be softened with oil before use, and the best oil was whale oil. Well, with a whale industry on site and a good port for the importation of the raw material, Dundee was well placed to grow this industry. The very coarse thread produced was used in the making of sacking and also canvas covering, such as the sails of ships. My American listeners will be interested to hear that the canvas was also used to cover the wagons used by the early settlers, and often seen in cinema screens in the cowboy movies. I was always a great fan of John Wayne myself, but that just might be giving my age away. The J for the jam factories arose in Dundee because of the vast quantities of soft fruit grown nearby, and the journalism was the production of comic magazines that children all over UK and in particular Scotland grew up with, the Dandy and the Beano probably being the most well known. Well, we leave Dundee behind and head northwest towards Dunkeld. If we went directly north, we'd arrive at Glamis Castle, the childhood home of the Queen Mother. Further south is Scone Palace, the palace where Scottish kings used to be crowned on the Stone of Destiny that I mentioned is now housed in Edinburgh Castle. But time's against us, so we continue on through Cooperangus and Blairgowrie and arrive in Dunkeld about 45 minutes later. Dunkeld is a beautifully preserved historic town on the banks of the fast-flowing River Tay. Yes, that's the same one that flows through Dundee out into the North Sea. And Dunkeld has an amazing history. The word Dun in Gaelic means fortification or castle, and Keld comes from the Gaelic Callian, which means Caledonia, so Dunkeld effectively is the fort of the Caledonians. It has a population of about 1,200 and has a small marketplace with a fountain in the middle of the square. Today it's famous for a fabulous cathedral at the far end of the village and has served this community for 800 years. So why a cathedral in this wee village of Dunkeld? Well, if you listen to my podcast on Scotland the People, I mentioned the Picts who inhabited the east coast of Scotland. Now it's known that a Pictish monastery was on this site from at least the 6th or 7th century, just when the Gaels moved over from the west. The first king of Scots, Kenneth MacAlpine, brought with him the relics of St Columba from the island of Iona to protect them from the invading Vikings. Without going into further historical detail, this place of worship took on such importance that in the 12th century the building of a cathedral was the ultimate compliment. You can walk in the peaceful grounds of the cathedral that has a grassy sloping bank down to the River Tay. On one side of the cathedral a graveyard, and the river side an open space with some oak, ash and conifer trees spread around. A beautiful, peaceful setting, and you can't fail to be touched by its serenity. And when you look back at this once beautiful 12th century cathedral, you will see that half of it's a ruin and the other half remains intact. This came about in 1560 during the Reformation, when the Reformers took it upon themselves to remove the lead from the nave roof and allowed that section to go to ruin. Cathedrals, after all, were idolatrous things in their minds. However, they left the choir area, and that smaller part of the cathedral is the Dunkeld church we see today. On the outside there are some interesting pockmarks in the stone, and those date from about 1689 and were caused by gunfire from another crisis in Scotland's history, a battle between the Jacobites and the British Army, who had already fought at the Battle of Killiecrankie some days before. The Jacobites on that occasion had been victorious and pushed the government army all the way back to Dunkeld. Unfortunately for the Jacobites, however, their leader, Bonnie Dundee, was killed at the battle. Nevertheless, the Jacobites descended upon Dunkeld, where the British army had already dug in. It turned out to be a real scrap, hand-to-hand fighting, door-to-door, and eventually most of the houses were burned and Dunkeld was left in ruins. And what you see today is a Dunkeld built from those ruins. Most of the houses date back to that period from about 1700 and still retain their natural charm. Well, we leave the cathedral grounds, and on strolling back to the car down Cathedral Street, you might want to pop into the Clouty Dumpling Cafe, which serves wonderful coffee and even more wonderful cake. For previous guests who've travelled with me in the past, you'll remember this walk from the cathedral to the village square. Well, the cafe used to be called Spill the Beans, that's just in case you were wondering where it had gone. As we leave Dunkeld to continue our journey north, we will cross the multi-arch bridge built in 1809 by the famous Scottish architect Thomas Telford, who built roads, canals, harbours and bridges. I mention him because we will be seeing more of his work as we return to Edinburgh later in the trip via Loch Ness and down the Great Glen. And before we get back onto the main road, I just want to mention the connecting town to Dunkeld, and that is the town of Burnham, especially for any Shakespeare lovers out there. Burnham is the location of the famous Burnham oak tree, nearly 600 years old, and that is believed to be the only remaining tree from Burnham Wood, which was named in Shakespeare's play Macbeth. You might remember that the witches prophesied that Macbeth will never be vanquished or defeated until Burnham Wood comes to his stronghold on Dunsinane Hill, a few miles just south of Burnham. Well, Burnham Wood did come to Dunsinane Hill, and as you well know, so did Macbeth's end. As we drive north, within 5 minutes the topography changes completely, from a relatively flat landscape to high hills and mountains beyond. In my podcast on Scotland the Place, I mentioned a geological fault line, the Highland Boundary Fault, and we're just about to cross it. And it really is quite outstanding. 1 minute the lowlands, and the next we are into the Highlands of Scotland. Well, it's at this point that I tell any children in the car to watch out for the native haggis running around the mountains. You know, that Scottish animal with 2 legs on one side, shorter than the 2 legs on the other side, so that it can run in a straight line on a mountainside. Really? Say the kids, as parents smile and look out of the window. And look out of the window they should, as the car starts its ascent into the Cairngorms in the heart of the Highlands of Scotland. So 20 minutes later and we find ourselves in the picturesque Victorian town of Pitlochry, which lies on the River Tummel. It's a town of about 2,500 people and is home to 2 distilleries, Blair Athol and Edinburgh. Until recently, the Edinburgh distillery was the smallest in Scotland, but that honour now goes to the Isle of Barra distillery in the Outer Hebrides, the islands lying off the west coast of Scotland. Pitlochry is a popular tourist resort and is a centre for hill walking in the surrounding mountains, such as Ben Vrachy and Schiehallion. Ben, by the way, is Gaelic for mountain. The River Tummel is part of the Tummel hydroelectric scheme and has a dam and power station on the river beside the town. It's one of 9 in the whole scheme. The fascination for tourists is the fish ladder. Before construction of the dams on the river were approved, there had to be provision for salmon swimming upstream to their spawning grounds. So a fish ladder was devised, and you can watch through a glass window as the salmon swim upstream and over the dam. One other thing that I like about Pitlochry is the Pitlochry Festival Theatre, and whenever I stay in the town, I book dinner and take in a show. It never disappoints. There's plenty of good hotels and bed and breakfast in the town, as well as good restaurants, so it's always a pleasure to stay over. The following morning, before we head north, we'll take a short trip to a small village called Grantully, where we'll find the fabulous Highland chocolatier to stock up for the rest of the journey with some exquisite chocolates. Yes, I have to admit I'm a bit of a chocoholic. The Highland chocolatier hand makes all the chocolates on this site and supplies Michelin star restaurants and hotels, so you're in good company. It's quite hard to leave, and the temptation to stick one's head in the chocolate fountain is overpowering. But resist we must and get back on the road towards Inverness. On our way north we pass Killiecrankie, the place where the first battle was fought in the Jacobite struggle in 1689. The Jacobites were supporters of King James, or Jacobus, thus the name Jacobites. King James VII had been removed from the throne some months before and had fled into exile in Italy. Supporters in Scotland took up his cause and thus commenced an insurrection which lasted over 40 years. More on the Jacobites later, because it's a story in itself. We are now heading for a visit to Blair Castle, which is only 15 minutes away from Pitlochry. And as we drive into the village of Blair Athol, a large wall on the right-hand side is evidence of a large estate within. And as we arrive in the centre of the village, a huge entry gate appears, and on turning into this entry, we'll find a long tree-lined avenue leading up to the magnificent Blair Castle. In the distance, it really does look like what you'd imagine a medieval castle to look like, with towers and turrets and threatening presence, and it can't be missed as it's painted white and really stands out in the vast grounds of this enormous estate. The original castle tower dates back to the 13th century, and subsequent buildings have been added down the years. Strategically, it is a commanding position on the main route through the Central Highlands in what is called Strathgarry, or the wide valley of the River Garry. It's set in 120,000 acres with glorious gardens and forest trails to attract visitors from all over the world. The owner is the Duke of Atholl, of the Murray family, and the family have retained possession of the castle for 700 years. The interior is extraordinary, especially as most of the heirlooms are original. The entry to the castle leads into a reception area which is like a 17th or 18th century armoury, with swords, spikes and rifles covering the interior walls. This leads into an amazing array of rooms, filled with artefacts from the past and present. The walls are adorned with works from some of the most famous artists, and rooms are filled with exquisite furniture of the finest quality. As I said, the Murray family have lived here for 700 years, and they've survived civil wars, feuds, clan wars, religious wars, to name but a few, and yet have retained this castle within the family. And that's not easy, especially when you consider the line of succession for inheriting castles in Scotland and the progenitor rules. That is, the inheritor of property must come from the original line, and in Scotland that is only the male line. I say this because succession to the title and the castle was complicated in 1996 by the 10th Duke dying without sons. The rules meant that the family had to go back up the family tree and find the next male heir, which happened to be a third cousin living in South Africa. So this poor chap got a bit of a surprise when he received a phone call one morning out of the blue, with someone on the other end of the phone calling him Your Grace, which is the formal title of a duke. When this new duke died a few years ago, his son inherited the title, and although he remains in South Africa, he returns once a year to lead the Blair Atholl Highland Games as its chief. The other oddity of this castle is that it is the only one that can raise a private army in Europe, a unique privilege granted to the family by Queen Victoria after visiting Blair Castle in 1844, when she had a personal bodyguard made up from Atholl Highlanders. I will revisit this castle at a later date because of the connection with the Jacobite cause, but for now we get back on the road north, and 10 minutes later we stop at the House of Brewer for a quick visit to one of the most upmarket shopping centres in Scotland. Effectively, it's a chic shopping mall. It houses a country fashion outlet with traditional tweeds, cashmere, art gallery and very upmarket shops for souvenirs. There's also a stunning market of fresh provisions, showing off the best of Scottish food and drink, and most products are locally sourced goods from small artisan producers. It's super, and although the restaurant gets a bit busy in the summer, not surprisingly, the food is good. Well, retail therapy over, we continue north and find ourselves climbing up into the Cairngorms, and the national park with the surrounding Cairngorm mountains as a gloriously picturesque backdrop. The national park was established in 2003 and is the largest in the UK at over 1,700 square miles. There is one other national park in Scotland, the Stirling Loch Lomond and Trossachs Park, and that's about half the size. About 40 minutes later, we see the telltale signs of the Dalwhinnie distillery up ahead. The pagoda-shaped chimneys and the white building with barrel-shaped containers outside. It lies in the village of Dalwhinnie, and at an elevation of nearly 1,200 feet is said to be the coldest village in Scotland. The distillery is the highest elevated working distillery in Scotland. Anyway, it's impossible to drive past, so using the excuse of a comfort break, we stop and enter the distillery reception area. I'll talk more on distilleries in a later podcast, so this is just to see what the distillery has to offer. Because of its position in the Cairngorms, it can be called a Highland whisky and also a Speyside whisky. Bit confusing, but more to come later. The site was chosen because of the spring water from the lochn called Doraine, and lochn is just a very small loch, a wee loch, and abundant peat on the surrounding countryside. The name Dalwhinnie in Gaelic means meeting place and refers to the meeting of ancient cattle drovers' routes through the mountains. In the reception area, we are greeted with the offer of a tour of the distillery or a tasting. Well, time's tight, so you, my guests, sit down at rustic wooden benches surrounded by hundreds of bottles of whisky. And with the distillery just next door and the aroma of whisky in the air, a tasting is just what's required. Well, one of the very experienced staff delivers a flight of 4 different Dalwhinnie whiskies on a wooden tray and explains each whisky that you're about to taste. A real treat in Dalwhinnie is that the tasting always comes with a special chocolate to complement the tasting. As far as the taste of the whisky is concerned, well, you're going to have to buy a bottle of Dalwhinnie for yourself to experience it. However, I'm going to read the notes from a Grand Master of Malt Whisky, which was written not that long ago. And he says, Dalwhinnie malt, tasting. I find it steeped in manuka honey with vanilla. Gentle smoke weaves its way through the cereal with a touch of spice. So please, do let me know if that's what you experienced when you tasted it. Well, feeling warmer inside, we leave Dalwhinnie and head north towards Inverness. On the way north, we pass the town of Aviemore, another tourist destination for climbing and skiing in particular. We also pass the road leading to Strathspey, the wide valley of the River Spey, and one of the 5 whisky regions, Speyside. Others being Campbelltown, Islay, Highland and Lowland. And yes, a future podcast on whisky will discuss these regions, and I hope to have a surprise guest to interview, an ambassador of Scottish whiskies. As we pass Speyside, we could reflect upon this area as having the greatest concentration of malt whisky producers in Scotland, with more than 50 distilleries in the area, including the famous Glenfiddich, Macallan, Glengrant and Balvenie, to mention just a few. We continue on and finally leave the national park and start to descend, and after a few miles we can see ahead of us the city of Inverness, standing on the banks of the Murray Firth. The Cairngorms Bridge is also visible, taking the main road to the far north, but for us that will be another journey, as Inverness is as far north as we will go on this occasion. Finally, we arrive in the capital of the Highlands, a term often used to describe Inverness, the last of the largely populated cities in the north. Inverness is an ancient cathedral city of about 65,000 people. The name comes from Gaelic, Inver meaning at the mouth of, and the River Ness, so the city at the mouth of the River Ness. And indeed the river passes right through the middle of the town and runs straight out into the Murray Firth, which is the main river dividing Inverness from the Black Isle to the north, and that river itself runs out into the North Sea. And that's important, because later, on our way south, I'll talk about the Caledonia Canal that connects Inverness on the east coast of Scotland to Fort William on the west coast, giving an invaluable route from east to west without going around the top of Scotland. Looking at the centre of the city, you could be blamed for not thinking of it as having such a large population. When you walk around the city centre, it's small in comparison with other cities in Scotland. I always feel as if I'm driving through continuous suburbs when I visit the city, and suddenly come across the centre, which contains one relatively small main shopping area, with the supermarkets on the outskirts of town. It is, however, a delight to arrive in the city. One minute you're driving down a road with buildings on both sides, and then suddenly you drive onto the main bridge in the town, which crosses the fast-flowing River Ness, with walkways on either side of the river. And as you come onto the bridge, you look up to your right, and standing up on the hill is a charming red sandstone castle, which, apart from its very clean look, could, with its towers and crenellations, have been built in the 14th century. It was not, however, and although a castle has stood on this site since the 12th century, this castle was built in 1836 as a courthouse and a prison. It still serves as office space for emergency services and local authority administration, and there are plans to open a museum and allow access to the public. I have to say, whenever I see the castle standing proud above the River Ness on its hill, it reminds me of a story about the old castle, which was attacked by the Jacobites in 1746. The castle governor refused to surrender to Bonnie Prince Charlie, so engineers were sent forward to place explosive charges against the castle wall. The Jacobites waited patiently, but nothing happened. The senior explosives expert decided to have a look at the charges, and he, plus his obedient wee Scotty dog, went forward to look at the explosives. They must have got within 20 yards of the gunpowder when it detonated. Both the engineer and the dog were blown right up into the air and landed on the other side of the River Ness. "Oh my God," I can hear you say. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to report that the dog survived. Well, it's time to check into our hotel, which is a short walk from the riverbank and the numerous restaurants. We are in Inverness for 2 nights, so tonight you'll eat at the hotel, and tomorrow night I have an excellent recommendation for you. It's been a great day, and the drive through the Cairngorms National Park was spectacular. Now it's time to put your feet up, relax over a scrumptious dinner and maybe another wee dram, and prepare yourself for a wonderful tour around Inverness and the surroundings tomorrow. Well, it's 9 a.m. the following day, and the sun is shining, occasionally through the clouds. It's mild and rain is not forecast. So it's time to take off for an exciting day's touring, and this morning we're going to visit a battlefield where the last hand-to-hand fighting took place in the United Kingdom, then a gigantic fort, and before we head back to the city centre, we will go back 4,000 years to have a look at an evocative prehistoric Bronze Age site. And spoiler alert for Outlander fans. We leave the hotel, drive to the east of the city and head out onto the road for Elgin and Aberdeen. We are soon in the countryside, and within 20 minutes we are approaching a large flat area of ground on the right-hand side. Then we pass a row of flagpoles with blue flags on top, leading off into the distance. Then there's a large monument formed like a cairn, a tall cairn, which is built of rough stones or boulders. And further on we see another row of flagpoles, this time with red flags on top, similarly leading off into the distance. And then we arrive at the entrance to Culloden battlefield, where in 1746 the last battle in Britain, involving hand-to-hand combat, took place. When I came here many years before, there used to be one small wooden shed with a warden taking a small sum for one to visit the graves of the fallen. Today, I'm pleased to say, there is an excellent visitor centre, and it's designed as a low-lying building so as not to distract from the sacred site of the battle. It is so well done. So what is this last battle all about? Well, effectively, it was the last stand of an uprising that had started 47 years earlier. I'll go into fuller details later when I talk about the Jacobite uprising, but in simple terms, the Jacobites were supporters of King James, the King of England and Scotland, who was exiled to Italy in 1689. Some of it was to do with religion, in that the government did not want to return the country to Catholicism, which James supported, and some was to do with politics, or the king's true belief in his divine right to rule, a belief that he had actually been made king by God himself. Because of that belief, he tried to control Parliament and upset a huge swathe of society. James in Latin is Jacobus, so the followers of Jacobus became the Jacobites. The first main uprising was in Scotland, and we passed the site of that battle at Killiecrankie on the way up to Inverness, and you may remember the battle that followed at Dunkeld. There were other unsuccessful risings in 1715 and 1719, and this all culminated in the grandson of James VII returning to Scotland in 1745 with the intention of taking the British crown back and re-establishing the Stuart dynasty. That grandson was Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie as he was known. The word bonnie in Scots is pretty or good looking, and from his portraits he probably deserved that title. Charlie was in Great Britain for just under a year, and against all the odds he got close to London and the British crown. But not close enough. He had to retreat back to Scotland all the way to Inverness, where he took the town. Close on his heels was the British Army, who camped at Elgin a few miles east of Inverness. On the 16th of April 1746, Bonnie Prince Charlie and his Jacobite army lined up against a powerful and well-trained British army under the command of the King's son, the Duke of Cumberland. I say British Army because Scotland, England and Wales had become Great Britain in 1707, and there were a mixture of Scots, English, Welsh and some Irish on the British side, and the Jacobites were similarly mixed with a French battalion in support. The armies lined up where we can see the flagpoles today, with the Jacobites represented by the blue flags and the British Army represented by the red. After some exchange of cannon, the Jacobites performed the famous and frightening Highland charge, but the well-trained redcoats were ready for them. For the Jacobites, it was a total disaster, and about 1,600 men died that day in less than an hour, of which 1,500 were Jacobites. It was a complete rout, and Bonnie Prince Charlie escaped to the Western Isles, and then back to France. He promised to return, but he never did. Walking out onto the battlefield today, it takes about 10 minutes to get to the line of red flags, the British line, and you can see in the distance the line of blue flags. At the red flag poles we turn right along a dirt track and meet up with another track leading up to the large cairn memorial. After a few minutes you can see the mounds where the graves were dug and where proud Highlanders and many of their friends lie today. Some have headstones with the names of the clans who took part, some do not. If we continue on, we reach the memorial cairn with details of the battle fought in 1746. Just a bit further on, almost the last mound, is a headstone with the name Fraser on it. This was featured in the Outlander series, and many fans of the story visit the site and that grave today. Now, if you don't mind me lightening the mood at this stage, there is one tale that I must tell about a couple that I had on tour with me and who were staying at Culloden House Hotel, the same place that Bonnie Prince Charlie stayed the night before the battle. I'm sure that the husband had chosen the hotel for that reason alone, apart from the fact that it is a delightful country house hotel. Well, in the morning, when I was going up the long driveway to the hotel, I could see them on the steps just down from the entry, and they appeared to be arguing. I decided to hold back, and when I arrived, I stayed in the car. Now, we were pushed for time that morning, so it was either Culloden Battlefield or Johnson's of Elgin, and they had discussed it the previous evening, and the Battlefield had won. Well, Johnson's of Elgin is a fabulous cashmere outlet. Anyway, there was a lively discussion between the couple, and it was going nowhere. In the end, and after a considerable silence, the wife blurted out in a high voice, "Look, as far as I'm concerned, a battlefield without a battle is just a field." At which point her husband's shoulders sagged and we headed off to Elgin and the cashmere factory. Different perspectives, different priorities, which I fully understand. The end to the story is a happy one though, because I made time and we were able to pop in to see Culloden Battlefield, albeit a shortened visit, before we headed off on our journey. More on the Jacobite story in a later podcast, but we are now off to visit a huge fort or barracks built as a direct result of that final battle and the possible threat of Jacobite uprising in the future. Well, we head east and get onto a minor road that leads through the famous Castle Stewart golf course, with the castle just visible in the distance. That leads down towards the sandy beaches of the Moray Firth, and we continue down to the point until we can go no further and park the car. It's all rather strange. You know that you've fed the right coordinates into the sat-nav, and there was a signpost that said Fort George, one of the most outstanding fortifications in Europe, but where is it? Well, if you look ahead, there is a path for visitors, and the ground seems to rise slightly. Then you can see a walkway between two walls, and ahead of you is a type of drawbridge and a dry moat below. Then before you know it, you are looking inside an enormous barracks and impregnable fortification. It is huge. Built with massive sandstone blocks and designed by the famous Adam family, normally noted for the design of exquisite Georgian mansions, the ramparts go on for almost a mile, and with cannons protecting every side. The inside is the size of 5 football pitches. In the aftermath of the Jacobite uprising, there was a need for a large standing British army in Scotland to suppress and repel further Jacobite insurgency. The fort took 22 years to build and is still serving the British Army today, after 250 years. Inside there are barrack rooms, a grand magazine, artillery pieces, a beautiful chapel and a museum. And at the far end of the fort, up high on the ramparts, you can look out onto the Moray Firth, directly opposite Shannonry Point and the lovely town of Fortrose on the Black Isle. This narrow gap is renowned for dolphins, and on a sunny day it's a great place to chill out, have a picnic and watch the dolphins performing in the sea below. Well, visit and picnic over, we head back to the main road, and after 15 minutes we head down a small narrow winding road towards a signpost that says Clava Cairns. You have to cross a tiny single-track bridge that used to have a rather disconcerting sign. It simply said Weak Bridge. I used to always wonder, well, how weak? Well, I'm pleased to say that the council has now added the weight limit to the bridge, and our Mercedes people carrier is within tolerance. Another few minutes and we arrive at Clava Cairns, the amazing remains of an ancient cemetery 4,000 years old. A cairn is a huge pile of stones, or boulders as we call them in Scotland, and they normally cover a grave with a stone coffin or kist, or sometimes they are chambered, allowing access at one end. The access point at Clava is orientated towards the southwest, towards the midwinter sunset, and on the exact date of the winter solstice, the sun shines directly into the tomb and lights it up. This was not done by chance, and our ancestors were far more clever than we sometimes give them credit for. The interesting thing about this cemetery is that there is a stone circle made up of large standing stones, and this is where the Outlander fans will perk up. Clava, it is claimed, is where Diana Gabaldon got her inspiration for the stones that Claire touches before being transported back 200 years. On my Outlander podcast, I will take you to the exact spot where this was filmed, so patience please until then. We have to leave Clava as we want to get into Inverness for a quick look around and some shopping before heading back to the hotel. It only takes 20 minutes and we are back in the centre and park the car on the riverfront. There are 3 buildings that I want to point out in particular, and the first is on a small hill next to the waterfront to the north of the main bridge. As we walk north there are a number of churches, but the one at the far end is the Old High Church, which dates from 1770, although the base of the tower dates from the 14th century. Tradition says that St Columba preached from this hill, upon which this church stands, in 565 AD. We'll then walk back into town and up a steep hill overlooking the River Ness, into the grounds of Inverness Castle that I mentioned before. As I said, it's a fairly modern 19th century castle, but it's the statue of Flora MacDonald from the Isle of Skye, standing right in front of the castle, that I want you to see. She has gone down in Scottish history as a courageous and selfless young woman in helping Bonnie Prince Charlie escape from capture by the British Army. How and why will be in my future podcast on the island of Skye. And from this high point you can see across the river the northernmost cathedral in mainland Britain, the Cathedral Church of St Andrew. It was built in 1869 and well worth a visit. But now it's off to the hotel to relax before stepping out later to enjoy a delicious meal at the Rockpool restaurant. And afterwards, a stroll along the banks of the River Ness, as tomorrow is another day, and so much more to look forward to. Well, this is the end of the second part of the touring trilogy, and having driven up through the Cairngorms National Park, we are now ready to head south again, taking in the Great Glen and Loch Ness, Fort William, Glencoe, Loch Lomond, and on through Glasgow before returning to Edinburgh. It's going to be a super trip, so please join me next week for the final part of our touring trilogy with Unique Scotland.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.